absolutely have so many people, and our populations are growing, they are young, they are dynamic, they are socially and economically mobile, and they are gaining a taste for all kinds of different foods and goods, and a lot of growth in the food system and in terms of demand will be here. But what Asia is missing is agricultural land. And so, you know, I actually spent a lot of time with an economist recently, and, you know, very far away from the downstream world I live in with all protein. This is an upstream person. And he believes that actually things like cultivated meat will take off in Asia first. And if you look at the data around consumers and their openness to things like cultivated meat, it's very interesting that Asian consumers, China, India, Singapore, Hong Kong, I think there was a Taiwan as well, very open to cultivated meat. And there's many reasons for that, and we can get into that if something is something that you guys want to explore. But the point that I'm trying to make is that there's an understanding in Asia that we don't have the same amount of resources in terms of land and water and energy. And so there's an openness to technology to solve our problems. And there should be, as opposed to in the West, where when you live in countries that are where you're surrounded by so much agricultural land and open fields, it sort of distorts your view of what is really happening at a global scale to arable and agricultural land volumes, which is that they are vastly shrinking. And so it seems like a less urgent problem. But here in Asia, we know we live in crowded cities. We know that the population is growing. We know that people are getting richer and they want more animal foods. When they get richer, they want more things like chocolate and coffee as they get richer, both of which require, you know, a ton of arable land. And they are open to solutions for their demand to be met. So it's really, really misleading to focus on the US narrative for the future of food.
Absolutely, I couldn't agree more. And I think you set like a really good sort of tone for the discussion today. And yeah, like look how far we've come from 2018 with just a few, let's say, VCs or even government, let's say, initiatives focused on food technology investments. We now have, you know, I think at least like almost 100 firms all around, let's say, the Asia Pacific region that are dedicated towards building that food tech ecosystem. And especially, you know, the cultivated meat piece that you mentioned, you know, Singapore is the first country in the world to approve the commercial licensing and sale of cellular agriculture meat with Eat Just, which was granted, you know, back in at the end of 2021. So I think, you know, what I totally agree. And I think, you know, for our audience, you know, it's really good that Sonalie has highlighted some of these points. And we're going to have like a, you know, a quick sort of open discussion, but please feel free to add your questions into the chat box, and we'll have some time dedicated at the end of our chat so that Sonalie can go through it as well. I just want to add something as well. With regards to the regulations, so like even with regards to certifications, I know that Malaysia and Indonesia are very actively interested in cellular agriculture, and they've already started drafting halal regulations and sort of meeting with different certifying bodies. And recently, I know that they've started launching a pilot plant in Malaysia, which is developed by Esco Aster. So yeah, what are your thoughts, like Sonalie, on how quickly, let's say, this technology is being adopted in Southeast Asia and also across the Asia Pacific region?
I would say that while I do believe, and I agree with the economist, that cultivated meat will likely reach mass consumers in places like Asia first because of the need. And let's take a step back and kind of lay out some foundation around regulation and market leadership, and Singapore approving cultivated meat first. Singapore, China, a lot of the other Asian governments they face very different headwinds than Western governments. For them, food security is a lot more tied to national security. And Asian governments tend to have a little bit more central planning around this food system. So they're able to really look into the future and say, right, what do we need to invest in today in order to be able to feed our population sustainably and affordably and nutritious, very importantly, nutritionally in 10, 20 years. And I think they have people around them, advisors, experts, scientists who have, made it very clear that you need a broad and varied toolkit of solutions. For example, like indoor agriculture, and cellular agriculture is also one of those solutions. It's just that we're a lot earlier on in the process. Now, I think that it is going to be quite some time before we really get cultivated meat in supermarkets. It's just physically, we're not there yet in terms of lab capacity, talent capacity, funding capacity. What I think you will start to see in the next 5-10 years, though, is countries in Asia funding these things, training talent, providing spaces, maybe at a deep discount, or maybe subsidized. I think that we will also move towards a stage where very high carbon emitting foods like meat and dairy will be either taxed or de-incentivized, because there will be more and more pressure to decarbonize the food system, or to at least be very transparent about the carbon budgets of food groups. And at the end of the day, Asian governments are very clear that the consequences of the climate crisis are affecting Asia the most in terms of the weather effects, the agricultural effects, right? So it's not just that we need to reduce carbon emissions in a void. We need to reduce carbon emissions because the less that we reduce them, the worse the effects of the climate crisis get. And the worse those effects get, the more impact on our agriculture yet again. And so there's this kind of negative feedback loop that governments are very aware of. And so we are going to go towards, corporates and industry having to account for the emissions of their production. And food is 1/3 of all, food production accounts for 1/3 of all global greenhouse gas emission. So there's no getting around that we need to decarbonize food. And that's before we get into things like land and deforestation and water as a resource, et cetera, and energy. And so I think that there'll be a ton more attention and funding and incentivization in the sector. I think that smaller governments will follow the lead of larger governments like China, or richer and more powerful governments like Singapore. But I think that I don't want to say that I really believe that in 5 years you can go to Red Mart and get cultivated meat. No, I physically don't think we have those capacities in terms of like the number of bioreactors we need. That's probably the biggest challenge. I think developing serums and the food that the cells need to grow and sorting all that stuff out, the medium, that can be sorted out. But the bioreactor space is actually a huge roadblock. And I don't know that we can build enough bioreactors in 5 years to really meet some of the targets. But what I do think will happen is just the attention and the funding and the focus on this space will really grow exponentially, especially in this part of the world. And that will bring innovation, right? And that will bring brighter minds and more people working to solve the problem. And let's be honest, where is the center of machinery development in the world, really? It's Asia. I mean, we're the factory of the world. So I think we have a huge potential also to kind of build out that machinery as an industry, in terms of as an industry that would bring in a ton of revenues and make Asia a real leader in the space, and also help bring the cost down. Because obviously the other big kind of question mark in this space is everything is so expensive, right? So it's very, very challenging to get cultivated meat to a mass market because of just the huge costs on all aspects. So
Yeah.
I don't know. The regulatory, yes, we need more regulatory attention, and we need countries to develop, frameworks, and that needs to happen in parallel. But I think there are more fundamental kind of access and R&D issues that need to be solved first.
Yeah, and I think you touched on a lot of great points, like really demonstrating that there have been substantial, let's say, movements around like finding data on how, let's say, food and agriculture is impacting climate change, and how this is also now translated into government policy to mitigate it, and how this can also pour extra funding and building up, let's say, alternative protein and more sustainable food, let's say, technologies in the region. I'm very curious because I know that your report actually covers a lot of the funding, let's say, movements, the flow of capital across the region and where it's being allocated. And, I'm just curious, what are some of the major trends that you covered in your report around funding, and like which countries are really backing alternative protein?
Do you mean, just to clarify, do you mean generally funds, or do you mean generally government funding?
So both, it could be private funds, government funding. I think for our audience, it would be good to understand like what kind of funding is being allocated towards these like, climate change solutions around food and agriculture.
So not specifically around cultivated meat. Yeah.
Yeah,
So I would say that generally not enough funding is being allocated to food at all. I think we're in a really interesting time right now. You've got this kind of gold rush for green funding that's happening because President Joe Biden in the US released the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act. And now the UK and the EU are scrambling to put out their versions of that act. But what's really, really fascinating to me is that once again, the climate conversation remains stuck on energy and transport, like basically EVs and energy and renewable energy. There is so little about food. And once again, I speak to people every day, and 99.9% of people do not seem to know that 1/3 of our global greenhouse gas emissions come from food production. So there is literally no getting around us having to alter our food system and come up with new tools in our toolbox to, to bulwark the industry against future challenges. And yet governments are simply not talking about it. Yes, there are a couple mentions around, biotechnology in Joe Biden's IRA, but they are small. They are really small. It's like a few $100 million, and they're not just all for food. It's for biotech in general, versus billions for renewable energy and for EVs and adaptation around electricity and transport. And it's just a huge problem. And if you look at the media, which obviously I live in that world, the media spends too much time talking about climate with regards to transport, energy, and weather. And there is just no attention on food. And something that has made me very upset is that, in the last 6 months, we've been dealing with kind of these mainstream media pieces about, that are very negative around plant-based meat. And I actually consider that incredibly irresponsible journalism, especially because a lot of these pieces are opinion pieces that are masquerading as reporting. But it's really, really not great that we are not clear on how important it is to invest in future-proofing our food system. And it is, and so at all stages of society, governments, politicians, journalists, editors, teachers, business people. I've been in rooms with chief sustainability officers whose job is, sustainability for their corporation, and they don't mention food. And it's just not great. It's really just not great, because food is literally the one thing we all need to have to survive. It is the one thing that, you know, secures safety and kind of a happy and joyful life for humanity. And so one of my jobs going forward is now going to be to really start making that connection much stronger. And I'm working on some initiatives to do that. But as a result of all of this, funding doesn't happen in a vacuum. Funding happens because of trends and focus and interests and government incentives. And we just simply don't have enough incentives, focus, trends around the future of food. Exceptions would be a government like Singapore, who seem to actually understand how crucial food is to the future in this environment of the climate emergency we're living in. But most governments are simply just not putting enough resources around that and funding. And there are many, many reasons for this. One of which is that in a lot of countries, farmers are a huge voting bloc, and they put a lot of pressure on politicians, right? Politicians really want to make sure they get farmer votes in a lot of countries, and farmers are, you know, have a very difficult job, but they tend to skew anti-innovation and wanting to keep the status quo. And so that puts a lot of pressure on politicians not to approve incentivization or funding to change food systems or to make adaptations. And so we end up with this very bloated industrial food system that is, you know, built on billions of dollars of subsidies for big meat and big dairy and big seafood and big egg. And we don't have anywhere close to the same kind of funding on the other side to fight that. And VCs and funds, they invest in what they think they're going to get a return on, right? A VC fund has got a 10-year horizon. So if they don't feel like there's going to be any government support for what the startups they're investing in are doing, it's harder to make a case. And so what you have happening in VC right now is that, you know, over the last 3 years, there was this media hype around plant-based foods especially, but future alternative proteins in general, as we started to see these huge shifts in consumer consciousness and consumer behavior. And we started to see the rise of Gen Z, a generation that really is voting with their values. You know, their patron saint is Greta. They're standing on the street and they're protesting against the government. They are aware of the climate crisis. They're making decisions based on, you know, what's going on and extreme weather events, and they're reducing meat. And so there was this kind of a little bit of a hype that was built. And so you had the food and impact VCs that were in the space and kind of knew the space and the founders. And then you had all these generalist VCs that sort of went, oh, wait a minute, am I missing out on this trend? And so they jumped in. And then when things cooled down a bit, or the media suddenly turned on the industry, then all those generalist VC, and of course there are other factors, you know, we have it, like, it's a very different macroeconomic environment than a year ago. All the generalist VCs kind of left the space. But what we should have had happen is government stepping in and going, actually, you know what, we need investment in this space. We need to bulwark our food system for the future. And so we're gonna commit, and that would have kept more private money in the pool. But instead, once again, we are at an impasse where money is now more expensive. People are cautious. VCs are and private equity companies funds are sitting on their funds instead of investing in them, and we are just not getting enough money into this space. And then there's this like negative loop where the media keeps saying it's a hype and it's not going to work out. And it's like, well, actually, folks, first of all, a lot of the data in the mainstream media is wrong. It's not a hype. The industry has not died. There's no plant-based meat is not a fad. We've just had some major reports released yesterday and today from the PBFA in the US and GFI showing that actually there's growth, and it's the trend is upward. But most importantly, the basic thesis for why we're here has not changed. Ever worsening climate crisis, less land, less water, less energy, more people, richer people, bigger demand for animal meat. So what's the plan? So it's hard to answer your questions without kind of zooming out and looking at everything that's affecting this whole loop and like where we've ended up. And so I would say the smart people and the smart money and the forward thinking governments are on track. But everybody else is missing the forest from the trees here.
Yeah, yeah, really well said. And I think like you said, for a lot of private equity, the Silicon Valley Bank collapse, as well as the Credit Suisse collapse, has really affected their I guess outlook on funding and made them more conservative, which is quite scary, because a lot of these startups do require funding to kind of remain viable, and especially with some of these like innovative technologies that require a lot of let's say funding towards capex and building infrastructure. Let's say the private equity funds are really their lifeline, especially if they're not getting access to government funds. So that's a really good point. And I think you also touched on, let's say, the role of the media and how it's important to also shape the narrative for everyone, from governments, mainstream, let's say, market views, as well as let's say investors, be it strategic or even like sector agnostic investors. And I'm just curious, from your work as well, because you're saying that there's like a huge backlash now from mainstream media on the alternative protein sector. But like, how is this view seen in Asia Pacific? Since there aren't that many, let's say, let's say focused media houses such as Green Queen Media that have that focus on sustainability. But has your, let's say, media house been able to impact Asia Pacific consumers on their opinions on alternative protein?
Definitely. I mean, this is not my favorite topic, because I don't really like to talk about what we do well, because I'm a bit shy about it, but I will just dive in and say Green Queen has a huge impact on the industry. I mean, we have platformed literally hundreds, if not thousands, of small companies that have then gone on to, thanks to us, receive funding requests, people wanting to work for them, more coverage in mainstream news. People don't realize, but a ton of editors and journalists read Green Queen. A ton of CEOs read Green Queen. Pretty much every impact and food investor in the world reads Green Queen. So what we cover we are like an amplification platform. We're not the biggest in the sense that we're not Forbes or we're not the New York Times by any stretch, but our niche and I think there's a lot of trust in what we do. And in our reporting, we're very careful to really focus on reporting responsibly. And I'm sorry to say that I don't think that's the same. I don't think other publications hold themselves to the same standards. That is probably what I'm most proud of. I come from a background of due diligence. I used to work in private equity, I used to work in risk management consulting, and I'm a big due diligence person. And so even though we have a voice that and content that appeals to mainstream consumers, we also are able to get a big business readership, because I think we do have higher standards of reporting and checking and just fact checking and all of that. And I think that unfortunately that is missing from this space. And that's what has allowed us to really carve out a niche. I think the other thing that we do that's very different is we're a much broader and more inclusive platform than a lot of the other platforms in the future food space that are either too technical or they're very focused, for example, on veganism. And while I have so much admiration and empathy and compassion for everything that vegans are doing, and I think it's a hugely important and influential movement, I think that for most people, that's not maybe where they want to start their future food journey. And Green Queen was not born out of ethical veganism. It was born out of health issues and sustainability concerns. And so we come at it in a different way, and we talk about the topics in a different voice, and we present things differently, and we're appealing to a much broader type of reader. And that's also been something that I think has helped us stand out and also grow. And then thirdly, I think that we are one of the only media that really platforms Asian and non-US, non-EU stories to the extent and to the volume that we do. And that allows us to have a broader, more balanced, more global, more empathetic perspective. And so that in the beginning, that probably was not playing to our favor because all the hype was in the US, but now it's really playing to our favor because people want a more balanced global view.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And I know we've touched on a lot of topics, but maybe like bringing it back to, Asia Pacific and some of the, the major trends that you covered in your report. What is your, let's say, favorite success story? I'm sure you have many, but like if you could share one with the audience on like a truly, let's say, Asian alternative protein company that made, strides and changes in the ecosystem, who would you like to highlight?
Gosh, there's so many, and I feel like I wasn't prepared for the question, so I might miss out on people, but I would say Sandia from Shiok Meats and like her journey, so fascinating. She's really made so many strides on the world stage. I would say the Tyndall team, starting out in Singapore and building out this global business and attracting huge amounts of funding. If we're including Pacific as well, then I would say Vow is doing some really exciting things. I think there are so many startups doing amazing things. As an ecosystem, I find South Korea to be fascinating. I feel like they came from having no ecosystem to now being one of the most exciting cultivated meat ecosystems in the world, and they are able to what I've noticed is they've made so much progress with like a tiny amount of funding. If you compare the funding levels that we get in Asia versus what they get in the US. So that's been really fascinating. People like Umami Meats, just really interesting what they're doing. Gosh, there's obviously Green Monday, I would say deserves a shout out. They really laid the groundwork for the plant-based movement across Asia and really kind of doing the work of going door to door to restaurants and schools and corporates and saying, we need to change our diet, Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that I totally agree. The South Korea story is like, something that just creeped up on everyone. I think what was it, a few weeks ago, they launched or showcased this like large like rump of meat, not even like, a piece or a ball, but an actual,
Biotech. Yeah,
Thyssen Biofarm. Yeah. So yeah, it's really, really crazy. And I think it really just, I guess adds the credibility that, South Korea is like a powerhouse for biotechnology and biomedicine, and how that was like easily then like translated into this like innovative food sector. Yeah, no, thank you so much for sharing those insights. I'm gonna open up for Q&A. So for any of you in the audience, if you have any questions, you can just type them in the chat box now. We have actually one question from Elaine Lee. So Elaine asks, has any research been done about the comparison of carbon emissions between traditional animal agriculture and cultivated meat? And then she says, as cultivated meat right now is on a lab bench scale or pilot scale, which is being scaled up and transformed to industrial, how are we going to measure and ensure that the carbon emission is lesser?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yes, Elaine, there has been data done, but as you rightly point out, the data is limited. First of all, there's very little research done because it's a very young industry. And secondly, there is an issue with comparing apples to apples, right? Because one is an entrenched global industry and one is, a pilot stage, early stage industry. I would say that there's the few studies that have come out have shown that it does depend on the type of animal protein. So there are huge savings for something like beef, whereas for chicken, it's a little more complicated. There's definitely a huge impact when it comes to land and water, and just generally like things like feed and not having to use antibiotics and not having to use hormones and just not having to have the space of keeping the animals. So that's before you look at things like ethical concerns. But one issue in cultivated meat, I would say, is energy. So a lot of the research shows that for cultivated meat to really leapfrog over conventional livestock agriculture and just be the absolute better choice, we really have to focus on renewable energy sources for production.
Great. Okay, I don't see any other.
Wait, one more ad, sorry.
Go
The other
ahead.
thing I would say, Elaine, is a lot of the conversation over the last 5 years, and especially over the last 18 months in the world of sustainability, has been on carbon. And we sort of have carbon blinders on. And this is something I deal with a lot in my other business, which is plastic and materials, but carbon is not the only measurement of what we need to fix. Let's not forget the cost to humanity of the superbug resistance that we have developed because we consume so many antibiotics from livestock meat, the hormone issues that have caused, you know, girls and boys to hit puberty at a younger age because they consume so many hormones from dairy milk and dairy products. There's also huge pollution concerns because livestock animal agriculture is hugely polluting to waterways and to soil because it's a very toxic process in terms of the waste that's emitted from the farms. And so that has a cost to society that we're not counting on. Then there's the deforestation cost and the wildlife and biodiversity loss because of that deforestation in places like the Amazon. There are so many layers of cost to that. So all of that is not included in a carbon comparison. So just remember that, yes, carbon is an important data point to look at, but it's also really important to look at all the other externalities that the meat industry is really good about kind of ignoring and hiding in the comparisons.
Absolutely. I think we have another question from Cassidy Clark. So he's asked, what difficulties do you face in convincing folks outside of Asia that the future of food is Asian?
Yeah, that's a great question, Cassidy. I face problems all the time. And mostly I think I face ignorance and misinformation. And just people not knowing, people having blinders on, just like people have carbon blinders on, people have global north blinders on. And I hope everyone knows what I mean when I talk about global north, but global north is like a term that really encompasses all the like richer OECD kind of NATO and top G20 countries, basically the richest countries in the world, who are rich because they colonized the world also. That's really important to say. And global south tends to be like Latin America and Africa and certain parts of Asia and the poorer countries that are developing. And the global north controls a lot of our economy, of our world, of our culture, of our media. And as a result, the narratives are very, very biased. And it's not always on purpose. Like, I don't think everyone in the global north is trying to ignore the global south or Asia, but it's just a lack of exposure, a lack of travel, a lack of, if you go to the US and you look at the news, I mean, Asia's not even mentioned. I'll give you a really good example. India is the most populous country in the world, and there have been some really big things happening politically. So the only opposition party of the Indian government is the Congress, and Rahul Gandhi, who sort of represents that opposition, has just been jailed, or he's been kind of indicted to be jailed. And I checked all the mainstream news sites of the world, and almost none of them reported on it on their front page. And India is the most populous country in the world and the biggest democracy in the world. So that's just on politics. So you can imagine that for food, the stories go way down. But what I find heartening is there's so much that social media has done to damage the world, but what it has done that's so good is it's just made it more possible for a diverse diverse storytellers to rise to the top and create their own niches. And so now you have media sites like mine, but also other ones. There's a great one called Rest of World that only talks about the news that is non-global north. It's fascinating. It's wonderful. And social media means that we can get exposure if we train the algorithms to stories that are be outside the mainstream. And that's really important. But what I face difficulty convincing companies that there's an opportunity in Asia economically, or just fundamentally because of our population size and our basic agricultural kind of stats that I've been talking about, which is that we have a limited amount of agricultural land on which to grow food. So my job is difficult because I start out with a level of kind of non-information or ignorance. So I have to just constantly come back with data and information. But that's the only thing I can do is show up on more panels, put out more content, grow my business so that we get a bigger viewership. I mean, that's what I can do. And go to conferences, represent. That's what I try to do.
Yeah, and this is something I really learned from you. It's really about being an effective communicator, and just really like, mentioning and highlighting, key stories and events that will really, sort of make more people understand and bridge, let's say, communities to really work together and foster partnerships. So yeah, we really love the work that you're doing because it's really giving a notable voice, to all of the achievements in Asia Pacific, which, like you've mentioned, not a lot of media houses pay enough attention to. We have one more question from Priya. So Priya asks, have you conducted surveys on the growth of flexitarian diets in Asia? And how can we build on some of the momentum we saw during COVID-19?
Sure. I don't particularly, I'm not a survey conductor because we're a news organization that we focus on the reporting of the stories. There are surveys out there that I would say not enough. But there are some that show that depending on the demographic, Asians are increasingly interested in reducing meat. I would say Asian consumers have very different motivations for approaching meat reduction than European and US consumers. European and US consumers tend to do so primarily for value reasons like ethics and environment. Whereas in Asia, it really tends to be more around food safety, traceability, and health. So Asians want, what they like about plant-based meat is that they're cholesterol-free, for example, or lower in fat, things like that. That's really what is motivating to certain consumers in Asia. But the one exception to that is Gen Z as a demographic is quite a flat generation. And by flat generation, what I mean is a Gen Z in Beijing and a Gen Z in Berlin they are actually quite similar in what that concerns them. Whereas if I compared my mother to your mother, Priya, they would probably have very different values, interests, motivations. Because in that generation, everybody was quite siloed in their own world. But the internet and apps and social media have flattened the world. And so Gen Zs tend to have similar values no matter where you go in the world. And what we're seeing is Gen Zs across Asia are adopting some of the same motivations for choosing plant-based meat and for adapting their diets, which is that they are concerned with the climate and they want a more ethical, more sustainable set of products in front of them. So these things are changing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would just add, I think in Asia Pacific, we have consumers that are just more used to having a flexitarian diet in comparison to either the global north or Western countries. So with let's say the adaptation of like, let's say, jackfruit, tofu, and there's also like, these sort of indigenous foods like tempeh have really sort of, introduced, consumers in Asia much earlier towards those concepts of flexitarianism and reducing the protein intake. And I think especially in sort of the Indian subcontinent, like a lot of these, let's say, concepts have been around for millennia, as well as China and through like Buddhism and other types of like religious or other, let's say, theological concepts. Okay, I think we have, yeah, sorry, go
Sorry,
for it.
I realized I didn't answer her second question. How can we build on some of the momentum we saw during COVID? COVID was a very specific set of kind of environmental factors that made people just much more focused on mental health and personal health and dietary health. And also there were huge meat and food supply chain shortages that caused plant-based foods to also kind of gain some market share. But I would say that what we need to do is we need to continue really educating around health, because as Dalal has pointed out, in Asia, we actually don't eat as much meat per capita. Well, depending. In Hong Kong, we do, but in certain other parts of Asia, we actually have a very healthy, much more varied diet. And what's really important is that we try to kind of stop the change, which is that when people move up to middle class and upper class, and they move up that chain, they actually, there's something called Bennett's Law, where they actually start to increase their animal protein consumption. And so what we really need to do is kind of not have Asia get to the point, like we shouldn't be aiming for a world where every Chinese person or every Singaporean or every Indian is going to eat as much meat as every American does today. Like that should not be the goal. And so how can we work to kind of implement options and education and resources to stop that trend from happening?
Yeah, absolutely. I actually have one last question before we wrap up, and that's really on the topic of like women representation in this ecosystem, especially like the alternative protein ecosystem within Asia Pacific. And I know that you mentioned a few, let's say, highlights of women entrepreneurs, but what would be, let's say, your words of advice, encouragement for women wanting to enter this sector?
I would say it's probably one of the best sectors to enter as a woman. Like at the end of the day, I do believe that women feed the world. We feed our children, we feed our households, we make something like over 80% of household consumption decisions. So why are we not just making all the food decisions? I don't know. I actually wrote an opinion editorial about this for Women's Day, and I would really recommend, if people are interested, for you to read it, because I think I answer this question much more eloquently than I'm doing now. But essentially, there is no future of food without women being in charge. And so I would encourage women to jump in any way, shape, or form. We need all the talent and all the skills and all the experience and all the expertise that we can get. This is not a, this is, and it's actually funny because I'm working on launching a new product, a content product for Green Queen that's going to be around careers, because I actually think a lot of people want to get into this space but don't know how. Yes, I can share the article. I will get it right now. Somebody's asked that.
Awesome, yeah.
I put so many facts in there, all about women and food. I really spent time on it because I wanted to have one place where I had put everything together. But it's actually shocking how few women are in charge of food, considering I've just shared the article in the chat. It's really shocking how few women are in charge of food. And of course, like the venture money that goes to women in food is even tinier than what goes to women in venture in general. And women are just underrepresented in funds, in boardrooms, in just everywhere. It's really a shame, because we really are the ones who prepare most of the food, do most of the grocery shopping, decide on the nutrition of our families and our household. So we really should be the ones designing the products and making the decisions. And to be honest, no offense to men, but as I say in the article, they've sort of not done a great job of it. Like our food system is broken and it has major fundamental issues because it's been decided on by men, and men make different decisions than women. This is like proven. I saw another article yesterday that came out that said that women-run companies tend to actually outperform male-run companies by a factor of 3, because women tend to make decisions that are much more broad and much more multi-stakeholder led. So I think that women are in some ways more likely to incorporate environment and climate and health and nutrition in a food decision than the equivalent male, because they are doing this every day. It's all about your personal experience. So if you're a guy and you don't prepare the food for your family, and you don't do the grocery shopping, and you don't think about the nutrition for your kids, then why would you think about any of those things when you're designing a product? But a woman is doing those things most of the time. Obviously, there are men who do make these decisions. I'm not saying there are, I'm telling you the data, which is that something like over 80% of household food decisions are made by women.
Yeah. Yeah, and on that note, really, thank you today for all of your amazing insights. We covered so many topics, from like funding, regulatory landscapes, innovations in food technology, as well as, let's say the effect of, mainstream media on shaping the narrative, how people can get involved in this sector. So really, Sonalie, it's been a pleasure. Thank you for being with us today and sharing all of these great insights. Is there anything that you'd like to leave to the audience where they can follow you on social media? Please don't forget to download the report, The Future of Food is Asian. But is there anything else that they should keep in lookout for, some of your upcoming events or like, press releases?
Well, yeah, if you have any press releases, obviously send them. I think you should definitely sign up to if you care about the future of food, I would not humbly say that I think our newsletter is the best. It comes out once a week. The next one's coming out tomorrow morning, and it really has everything from all over the world. So it is I'm putting the link to sign up for the report and for the newsletter in the chat, but it's the most comprehensive future of food newsletter, I think, out there. And it is not coming from any kind of ideological backing other than our food system needs to be protected and fortified in an environment of a climate crisis. That's it. That's the thesis. I'm not trying to convert you to anything. I'm not asking you to give up your traditions. I'm not asking you to never eat meat again. I'm just saying, here's some information about how we can add technology, innovation, and solutions to our food system that is being severely impacted by the climate crisis.
Yeah. Yeah. And on that note, thank you so much for your ethical, informative news. We look forward to hearing more from you. And thank you to all of our audience for tuning in. We hope to see you soon for our next coffee catch-up next month. So all the best. Thank you, Sonalie, and we hope to see you soon in Singapore. If not, we'll see you very soon in Hong Kong.
Thank you so much. It was so great.
All right. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.